Hello and welcome to Chillers and Thrillers. I'm your host, Em, and in this podcast, I read true stories of people's encounters with the strange and unexplained. No comedy, skepticism, or gore, just 100% true spooky tales. Last season, I did an episode on children's experiences with the paranormal and past life memories. In that episode, I recalled my own personal experience of being visited by my grandfathers and being able to identify them from a family picture when I had never met them or seen that photo of them before. As you can imagine, I find this topic incredibly interesting. Similar to many people, I also believe that children are very close to the other world and have the ability to see spirits and entities, be clairvoyant, or recall their past lives in exact detail. By turn, I also believe children are beacons to the other world. Their purity and energy seems to become a magnet to entities, demons, and what some believe are the Fae. Some of these entities are malevolent and seem to want to grasp the energy that children have, a way to use it to connect to this world. In this episode, I'll be reading more true stories of children's encounters with spirits, entities, the Fae, and past life reoccurrences. As always, I would love to hear your stories and experiences or just your feedback on the podcast in general. Our first story is one written by Reddit user wolf_dream. I wanted to personally thank them for letting me use their very creepy but incredibly well-written story. Now, turn down the lights, get cozy, and let's get started. My trip to the slaughterhouse. A story my mom wouldn't tell me until my 30s. Submitted by user wolf_dream. So let me start out by saying I enjoy writing this, so it will be long. But hopefully it will be an interesting read. I also admit that I have absolutely no memory of this experience. I was a little over 2 years old and had just started walking on my own when this event took place. My mom only told me this story around 3 years ago when I was 32 and about to get married. My mother was raised in a very tiny fundamentalist Christian community and had no belief in the paranormal. She believed that our souls sleep until Judgment Day or something like this. Ergo, there are no ghosts or spirits to haunt houses. Even over 30 years later, she sounds terrified as she told me this. This woman, who always talks way too loudly, was literally whispering by the end of it, and she was as white as a sheet. I believe her completely and still do. My mom never talks about stuff like this. I'm just glad I can't remember it too. In 1988, my parents had their second child. This was my brother, Victor. We were very crowded in our rented flat with 2 babies. My parents decided to move to a rambling old 2-story farmhouse on a 7-acre plot in southern Ohio for more room for the family. It was way out on the sticks and took almost an hour to get to town from there. My mom said the first time I saw the house, I freaked out. I was crying and saying things like, "I don't like the mean house, ugly house, scary house, Mama, don't like." My mom says this behavior was very out of character for me, but I stopped complaining about the house after a few weeks, so she chalked it up to the stress of the move. Now this house was ramshackle and in the middle of nowhere. The kitchen was to the far rear of the house, and until recently before we moved in, still had a working, ancient, wood-burning cooking stove against the back wall. This had caught the back wall on fire a couple months before we moved in and caused a lot of damage. A lot of this damage wasn't fixed, so my young, broke parents got a very cheap rental agreement. Gotta love the 1980s. On the second floor, directly above the kitchen, was a locked room. The landlord claimed it had heavy fire damage, but her son, who had done the repairs, claimed the only fire damage left was in the kitchen, since it had been the worst and was beyond his skill level to fix. Either way, the landlord was adamant that the room was off limits, and my parents always respected that. I know all of this because I heard stories about the crappy farmhouse with the creepy door my whole life, and there were pictures of us in and around the farmhouse. The locked door was right next to the upstairs landing, so there was no avoiding it, and both my parents have told me it gave them the creeps. A few months after we moved in, my mother and I were in the yard with our pit Doberman mix, Boss. My mom was hanging laundry and I was rolling around with the dog. She said that just as she noticed that everything was way too silent, Boss started going crazy from surprisingly far away. About 500 yards from the house on the left, there was a small duck pond. Boss was in between the two, running towards my mom, then turning and running back towards the pond, barking frantically the whole time. My mom saw something thrashing around in the middle of the pond. She took off towards the water at full speed. Boss beat her there and pulled me out of the water himself. Although my mom was confused how I got so far so fast and how I got into the center of the pond since it was over my head and I couldn't swim, she figured she underestimated me and brought in the baby gates and playpens. I was to be contained from then on. A few weeks later, she was cooking downstairs. Boss was outside, my little brother Victor asleep in his crib, and I was playing my playpen in my room upstairs. I also had a gate on my door and one at the top of the stairs. The stairs ran from one side of the kitchen, so my mom said she could listen for us crying and fussing while cooking. She said that no longer than 15 minutes after the last time she had looked in on us kids, Boss starts going crazy again in the yard. She runs up to check on us. Victor is asleep, every baby gate is still shut and locked, but I am not in my room. A frenzied search reveals I'm not in the house at all. A sudden image of Boss saving me from drowning causes my mom to rush outside to see what he's trying to tell her this time. She says that he was running in circles in the yard, barking uncontrollably. When she got outside, he took off towards the right, away from the pond. He would run ahead, turn around, and bark at my mom, wait for her to catch up a little before racing off again. He ended up leading her almost 1.5 miles out onto the dirt road that separated our property from our neighbors. He led her to a thick stand of trees on our neighbor's side of the rocky drive. My mom says what hit her first was the foul stench of advanced decay. She plowed into the trees with her heart in her throat and her stomach full of ice. She said she noticed many piles of corrugated tin, tarps, tires, and other debris. The miasma was emanating most strongly from these junkyard cairns. Peeking under a sheet of tin, she discovered the extremely decomposed corpse of a butchered cow. As she headed deeper into the thicket, where the tree cover was denser, she said less care was taken to cover the remains. Grisly pieces of bone and chunks of bovine littered the area. Apparently, our neighbor, in an effort to cheat his taxes, had been illegally slaughtering cattle and hiding the remains in at least one of the few thick stands of trees around. She found me in the dead center of this thicket, just standing there, looking around like I was confused. She said I didn't seem scared or anything, just standing. She rushed over to me, and after ascertaining that I wasn't injured, began questioning me on why I was here, how I got here. Keep in mind that although my mother said I started speaking very young, I still didn't have a vocabulary. She said I told her, with a serious look only small children can give, that the children brought me here. Terrified at the thought that anyone, even children, could walk right past her through the kitchen, get me from upstairs, and walk right back past her on the way down the stairs and out with me, she demanded to know what children and where the heck they were now. I looked at her, dead serious, and told her the ones that lived with us in the room at the top of the stairs. And I couldn't see them anymore. After a moment of stunned silence, she started asking all kinds of questions about these children. However, she told me that I refused to say anything else. She said as long as she questioned me about what happened, I would just stand there staring at her, with a serious expression and my mouth closed. She said this same pattern held true every other time she brought it up to me. She was always left wondering, and immediately began hounding my dad about moving closer to town. While the incident with me getting to the pond was highly unlikely, it was at least remotely possible. My mother is adamant that me being in the hidden slaughter yard that day was flat impossible. She says there is no way I would have even known it was out there, much less have the ability to open and relock the baby gates, get downstairs, past her, and end up almost 2 miles down the road and in this place in under 15 minutes. I was only 2 and as slow and clumsy as most toddlers. As I said, she's still shaken by it after 30 years. Personally, I have no idea what happened that day. I've thought about hypnosis, but haven't yet decided if I really want to remember. Maybe it's better to let it be a mystery, because whatever those things were, I really don't think they were children. The Man on the Stairs, submitted by user D. Smith. It was an eventful pandemic. My relationship disintegrated. I broke up with my partner, I bought a house, and my 2-year-old daughter and I moved into it. It's very old, at least 120 years old, in a very small house. Just a big box with the kitchen and living room downstairs, a staircase in the middle, and the second floor with 2 bedrooms on either side of a landing. In other words, no attic or dark corners for anyone or thing to hide, and sound travels very easily. A few months in, my daughter started complaining about the scary guy coming up the stairs. According to her dad, the scary guy is never an issue at his place, where she spends half her time. But every night at my house, with varying degrees of fear or concern, she calls me upstairs, saying, "Mommy, the scary guy's coming up the stairs." At first I thought it was a stalling technique, but sometimes she seems genuinely scared. Of course, I don't hear or see anything, and I've never believed in ghosts or spirits, so we talk about imagination, come up with happy thoughts to crowd out the scary thoughts, that kind of thing. It's still an issue, but it started to get even weirder. 2 weeks ago, she called me upstairs, yelling, "What was that noise, Mommy? What was that?" And when I asked her what she was talking about, she made this creepy croaking noise that she insisted came from somewhere in her room. And last week, she told me that the pictures on the wall were moving. Since she was old enough to talk about feelings, she found it easier to talk about big feelings with a proxy. So when she's scared or upset, she'll hand me a stuffed animal and say, "Talk to them." A couple of nights ago, she told me to talk to Ghost about the scary guy. She handed me a cute little stuffed ghost toy that had been a Halloween present. I stared into his glassy eyes and said, "There's no scary guys in this house, right, Ghost?" But before I could make Ghost say anything, a big, heavy flashlight falls off the dresser with a bang. My heart was pounding for hours. There's always an excuse. The flashlight was knocked over by the fan. The pictures that looked like they were moving was because of the nightlight. The noise must have been from outside, even though her window was closed. Then, last night happened when she said, "It's okay, Mommy. The scary guy wants to be my friend. He wants to get in my bed and snuggle me." From the Mouths of Babes, submitted by user Hunted the Buffalo. When my older sister was born, my parents moved into a small house. And in that house, the laundry room was right across the kitchen table. So my sister would often be seen waving and staring and giggling while looking into the laundry room. This behavior continued for a long time, and when she could finally talk, they asked her who she was talking to. To this, she looked at them and said, "The little boy." My parents asked if he was nice. She waited a moment and then replied, "Yes." After this, she seemed to grow out of it and forgot all about it to my parents' relief, and they dismissed it as an imaginary friend. They never mentioned it after that. When I was born, I exhibited the same behavior, and when I could talk, they asked me who I was talking to. I replied, "The little boy." They asked me if he was nice, and I did the same thing as my sister, although a bit different. "Yes," I replied, although I think he's lying. My own ghost story, submitted by user LucyJae. Ever since he was a baby, my cousin Ty has just known things he shouldn't. And not to get all old wives' tale here, but he was born with 6 fingers on each hand. His preternatural knowledge ranged from just knowing there was something wrong and giving you extra love, to the time he was in the car with his mom, passing our old house, and said, "That's where Uncle Toby's dog is." He was 3 years old at the time. We hadn't lived in that house for 9 years, but up on a hill behind the house is indeed where Smokey Joe, the only dog my dad has ever considered definitively his, is buried. Around the same time, Ty, his parents, Aunt Kim and Uncle Jimmy, and my older cousins Jane, Derek, and Andrea moved into a house that could better contain them all while they built a new house. We're from a small town, so not surprisingly, my dad and all my uncles had been friends with this guy, Bud Dale, that grew up in that house. Almost as soon as they moved in, Ty started talking about the nice lady that lived in there with them. Being a very little kid, everyone chalked it up to an imaginary friend. Even Ty turning up with treat money in the form of coins minted in the 50s and 60s didn't really register as weird. It's when things started happening to other people in the house that everyone took notice. My Uncle Jimmy never felt alone in the bathroom, and almost always, without fail, only when he was in the shower, water in the sink would turn off and on. The temperature of the shower would change drastically, or the toilet would flush. Faulty plumbing, ghost hunters would say. Once again, it could be written off. One time, my Aunt Kim came home from work late and saw a feminine figure in the window of the older boy's bedroom. Thinking she had busted one of them with a girl in their room, she rushed into the house. Both of them were snoozing in the living room. Now she thinks that maybe they made it downstairs in time to pretend they'd be sleeping, and she checks the house for a girl, to no avail. Now, it's entirely possible that someone could have snuck out the back door, but to this day, my cousins swear they didn't have anyone over. My own experience with this presence came one evening when I was babysitting Ty. I was 14, my cousin Derek is a year older than me, and we were hanging out while he was waiting for it to be time to go meet his friends. Eventually he left, I locked the door behind him, and maybe 10 or 15 minutes later, I hear a knock at the side door. So I went to see who it was and left Ty playing in the living room. At this house, there is a long, narrow porch leading to the side door, which is visible from the living room windows. I never even considered the fact I hadn't seen anyone pass by, and its jamb meets at a right angle with the door jamb to go upstairs. Which, being in an old house, there's actually a door there to keep the warm air downstairs in the winter. So I get to the door, and there's no one there. As I turned to walk away, I got the very distinct feeling that someone was on the stairs. And suddenly, the door swung out a little bit and slammed shut. Sufficiently freaked, I ran into the living room. Ty looked at me and told me not to be scared, that it was just a nice lady. And some sort of instinct, I called out, "It's okay, I'll take good care of him." There was another light knock from the kitchen, but nothing more. I had what I felt like a solid experience, but by pretty much everyone else in the family, it was blamed on a draft and my overactive imagination. Throughout all of this time, Ty keeps talking about the nice lady. Things the nice lady told him, things she gave him pop up from time to time. And finally one day, my aunt, uncle, and Ty were at their church, and he kept talking about how good it was the nice lady came with them, and was talking to someone who wasn't there. My uncle took him aside, a little displeased, and told him essentially to cut it out. Ty insisted she was there, and Uncle Jimmy asked Ty to describe her. Ty started to describe the nice lady, and as the description came out, my uncle started to press him for more details. As the details came, he got more and more creeped out. The nice lady, it turns out, sounded exactly like Mrs. Dale, the mother of Bud, childhood friend of my uncle's, who originally lived in the house. What we all came to realize was that Ty could see the spirit, and that she was interacting with him. He wasn't scared of her at all, and soon the family moved into their new home, and Ty stopped mentioning her. But he always had this sort of look in his eyes that you knew he was thinking about heavy stuff, even at 8 or 9. And when I'd be home from college or later visiting when I moved away, he still seemed to have that way, where if something was bothering me, which I'd be hiding to keep family time happy time, he'd be there by my side, just trying to be goofy or doing something to distract me. So I always wondered how much of the nice lady stuff he remembered, or if he was still seeing things but had learned to keep quiet about it. The Man in the Window, submitted by Anonymous. My girlfriend was living with her mother at the time, and there was always this little kid from across the street who would just stand and stare at the house. One day, her mother's going to get in the car and go to work when the kid asks who the old guy is that lives with them, and why he never leaves the house. Her mom is pretty puzzled and asks, "What guy?" She's divorced and there were no males living in the house. The kid looks up at the second-story living room window that he's always staring at, points, and says, "The guy who's always standing there, staring out the window." Kind of scared, her mom replied, "There's no guy that lives with them." She said the kid turned whiter than white, just turned and ran. After that kid did everything he could to avoid the house or even looking at it. Hamburger, submitted by user DebbyV. A few years ago, my then 3-year-old had a fever which I was treating with baby Tylenol. I gave him his dose before bed, got distracted, and walked into his room to see him holding the medicine bottle in one hand and the dropper in the other, saying, "I give myself a medicine." So anyway, we go to the ER. 4 hours later, a blood test confirms he didn't actually ingest any medicine. Whew. So we head home in the middle of the night, exhausted but fine. But while he was there, a nurse gave him a stuffed bear. My son named this bear Hamburger and started sleeping with him in his bed. Being an imaginative preschooler, my son pretended to talk to Hamburger a lot, and Hamburger would tell him things. One day, he walked into the living room and demanded crayons and papers because Hamburger told him he had to draw a picture. The picture that Hamburger made him draw terrified me. It's a bunch of dead people in a graveyard with headstones above them. Hamburger told him to draw them red. They have X's in their eyes. They are all smiling. It's been years, and I'm not sure where Hamburger is now. The toy box maybe, but I'm going to keep him there. I asked my son if he remembered the drawing, and he said, "Yeah, those are dead people." Just a quick side note, the user actually posted the picture, which I'll include in the podcast Instagram page and the YouTube page as well. The Woman, submitted by user Executor Elassus. Not my story personally, but from a friend of mine. My friend grew up in a house in the country her father had built. It was a weird place. 2 levels, an octagon over a pentagon, creating all these strange angles in the rooms, set out sort of like a spiral. It's a lovely house itself, with all these amazing little hidden features. The master bedroom, for example, juts out in a little pop-out box outside of the wall, like a window box, so that you can look up at the sky from the bed. It also had some weird parts, like there were no doors anywhere, even the bathroom, instead relying on creative angles to block lines of sight. Anyway, when she was little one winter, she woke up in the middle of the night with a start and came out of her room into the living space. There was a woman standing in the middle of the living room that she didn't recognize. The woman was beckoning her with her hand to come closer. My friend wasn't sure what to do, so she stood there for a bit looking at the woman, trying to figure out if she should do anything. That's when she noticed that the woman was resting her other hand on the cast iron stove that stood in the middle of the living room. It was the middle of winter, and the stove had been stocked up to burn all night. The outer walls were glowing red hot. This is when my friend started screaming, which woke her mother up. Another feature of the master bedroom is that it looks over the living room like a sort of balcony. My friend's mother ran to this overlook, and that's when she was hit with some feeling of such abject terror that she couldn't bring herself to look over the ledge into the living room. Imagine your child is just out of sight, screaming in terror, and whatever is causing that terror exerts such a force on you that all you can do is huddle down and pray that whatever that thing is, it goes away. My friend doesn't remember what happened after that. Years later, she was at a fair and visited a palm and tarot card reader. When she sat down, the first words out of that woman's mouth were, "The spirit that scared you as a child meant you harm, and you will have 2 more such visitations in your lifetime." Break on through, submitted by user MrsBobLoblaw. Not so much scary, but definitely creepy and a legendary story in my family. When I was about 3 months old and my brother had just turned 2, my parents took us out in the car. They stopped at a grocery store and my mom ran in to get a few things while my dad stayed in the car with both of us. Now, my brother had just turned 2 and was not talking a lot, let alone full and complete sentences. He was mainly stringing 3 or 4 words together at a time. Mommy, want cookie, that kind of thing. So we've been in the car for about 5 minutes when the Doors song, Break On Through, comes on the radio. My brother starts to sing word for word. Perfectly pitched, not missing a beat or a syllable. My dad, dumbstruck, wait until he finishes. The song ends, and my dad turns around, looks at my brother, and says, "Buddy, how do you know that song?" "I wrote it." "You wrote it?" "Yeah, a long time ago, in a dream." Needless to say, both of my parents were simultaneously freaked out and impressed that their son was clearly the reincarnation of Jim Morrison. My daughter, submitted by user KayFry. I've always known my daughter was different. From the moment of conception, her existence has been the one constant throughout a series of strange events, ranging anywhere from merely bizarre to utterly terrifying. It started while I was pregnant with her. My husband and I decided to rent his childhood home from his mom while she remarried and subsequently moved out. I was around 7 months pregnant, and I started to have these insanely realistic dreams. Well, I thought they were dreams. For instance, I kept having this dream that I couldn't scratch an itch, just to wake up and look down and see that I was covered in spiders. Upon hearing my screams, my husband would run in to see if I was okay. Naturally, he saw nothing. I began to think that I was just having a vivid, reoccurring pregnancy dream. It was always the same thing. Dream, wake up to spiders, freak out husband, repeat. Until the time that I couldn't get up. On this particular night, my husband was away visiting with friends. I woke up as usual, looked down, saw all the spiders all over me. But this time, I couldn't move. I was pinned down to the bed by this black mass. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even look away, like it was forcing me to watch. For some reason, though, I noticed that my belly was not covered in the same darkness as everything else. I began to calm down and refuse to let this evil thing get the better of me. Besides, I still wasn't convinced that I hadn't simply been experiencing sleep paralysis. Fast forward through the next few months. Typical weird, spooky junk. Lights turning themselves on, weird noises and voices, footsteps. I remember being on the phone with a friend when the ceiling fan turned itself on and started spinning so fast that I thought it was going to fly out and crash onto me, until I screamed at it to stop, and it halted with such ferocity that I was scared all over again. Still, it was somehow subtly threatening, mostly on the edges of everything, just out of sight. The first truly memorable event came on my husband's birthday, 3 months after my daughter's birth. We had company over, and I saw that the lights on the monitor were going nuts, indicating that she was crying loudly. I didn't remember turning the volume down, so I grabbed it and excused myself to go and feed her. Imagine my surprise when I opened the door to complete silence, and our daughter fast asleep. The monitor in my hand was still wildly flashing. A little spooked, I turned to leave and was met with a shattering scream. I pick my daughter up and sit down on the rocking chair, trying to soothe her. That's when the darkness came back. Wide awake and sitting there with her in my lap, the same black cloud that enveloped me just a few months before was back. It was pressing down so harshly that the air left my lungs and I couldn't hear anything except a dull ringing. I dropped to the floor, still clutching the baby, and crawled to the door. I could see that the doorway was its limits. It was like trying to swim with lead weights strapped around my ankles. As soon as I hit the hallway, it disappeared, and she was screaming again. We moved out shortly after that, which is when we discovered that it wasn't the house. When my daughter was 2, she nonchalantly looked up at me and, being absurdly eloquent for her age, said, "I was supposed to be your sister, but God said I wasn't ready, so he held me back and let me be your daughter instead." Now, what kind of thing is that for a 2-year-old to say? The same 2-year-old I overheard having a full-on conversation, and when I asked her who she was talking to, she responded so incredulously, "You can't see him? But Mommy, he's sitting right there. He's covered in blood." Followed by a barrage of giggles and whispers with Jeremy over how silly I was pretending not to see the fully grown man right in front of my face. The same little girl that I would come upon night after night, standing in the middle of a darkened room, staring blankly into space. The girl I comforted on the other nights while she screamed and thrashed in her sleep as she battled night terrors and voices that wouldn't go away. Nothing prepared me for the worst of it, though. The moment she began to feel fear, where before there had only been innocence. As the night terrors got worse, we tried everything to soothe her spirit. Eventually, we hung a cross on her bedroom door and prayed over her space. The next night, as I went to shut the door after an hour of her sobs and trying to coax her to sleep, she sat straight up and screamed, "Mommy, please," she begged. "Please don't shut my door. It's the only thing that keeps him away from me, that keeps him from getting to me." Keeps who away? The dragon man. The one that's always been trying to get me. He lives in the corner of my room and watches me. He always just watched, but now he's finally trying to get out. I turned, wondering what the heck the door could possibly have to do with anything, just to look up and see the crucifix we had hung the night before, in the angle of the door, perfectly cutting off that entire corner of her room. I nearly collapsed. The one that's always been trying to get me. It's like I suddenly felt him there too. Like I'd always felt him on the edge of everything. My husband and I wedged her door open so it was stuck that way and couldn't be shut anymore. We moved again shortly after that, and as she grew, she became less and less scared of him, until he was just an annoyance to her. Every so often, though, she comes down in the middle of the night and I recognize the haunted look on her face, like she's just tired of the things that visit her. Except for Grandma Rosie. She likes it when she comes to sing her to sleep. And that's all for this episode. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these stories. Do you believe that children have the ability to see things that we can't? Or to remember things from their past lives? Feel free to drop me a line at chillersandthrillers@gmail.com. If you're enjoying the podcast, I would truly appreciate it if you left me a rating and review in your preferred podcast subscriber. Don't forget, the YouTube channel also hosts the podcast and stories that don't make the podcast episodes. Thank you for listening. I hope all you ghouls and ghosts stay safe, and I'll see you next time.